From the southernmost point of Dorne to the lands of always winter, what is west of Westeros and the shadows of the east, this is Casterly Talk. I am Alden Diaz, here today to discuss something with you that has shaken the foundations of A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones fandom, House of the Dragon fandom, and we want to dive straight into it. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, like it will guarantee you the status of heir to the Iron Throne. Now, let's get right into it. Aegon's dream, Aegon's vision of what was going to happen to the land of Westeros and eventually the entire world. This has been a thing that has caused so many different conversations. So I wanted to come here onto Casterly Talk to join you fine folks to explain what I interpret this dream as, the way that I gathered different questions from this dream and what I think it's telling us and what I think it could be indicating and how it raises perhaps more questions than it does give answers, but in the best way. Now, my first thought when we actually heard Viserys explain to Rhaenyra this dream, what it means, what Aegon's entire philosophy was in terms of the conquering that happened, at the beginning of the Targaryen dynasty, was this idea of unreliable narrators, information leaking, things getting out. I couldn't help but fixate on the fact that on a meta level, it is cute, it is kind of funny, it is kind of a wink wink nod nod in a good way that Aegon's dream be called the Song of Ice and Fire, the in-universe, in-world name for George's world being represented. But it's also interesting that we already kind of did that in the Game of Thrones season 8 finale. We had now Grand Maester Samwell Tarly saying that the Archmaesters at the Citadel, Archmaester Abros, had written the history, everything from King Robert's death all the way to the end of the show, was now going to be called the Song of Ice and Fire. So there's also that in-universe name, which started to get me on the track of who knew. Who leaked this to the Maesters? Who was the person that actually told not only their heir, but also somebody else? And that got me really, really thinking, well, if this person knew, then this. Well, if this person knew, then this, which I think is part of the exciting point. It's part of the exciting meat of what Rhaenyra is being told. Not only is it changing their family, it's changing the realm, it's changing the entire context of everything that we've seen. And we can have fun thinking about, well, if the information got here, then maybe that means this. You look at the different Targaryen rulers, and that's when it gets interesting to me. Look at somebody like Maegor. Maegor, this monstrous king, this cruel leader, known as the Cruel. What does that mean for his rule? Does that mean that he was only this way because he knew that something was coming? Does that mean he was only this way because he was trying to create a land that would fall in line with him? I mean, that's a terrifying proposition, but also to know that people can be driven mad. Does that descend all the way down into Aerys, the Mad King, all the way down right before the core events of a Game of Thrones or, of the book series, A Song of Ice and Fire? Does that mean that that motivated his mental breakdown, his madness, his cruelty, his monstrous attitudes when it came to, of course, burning them all? And there have been fan theories about that for years. Did he mean burn them all in terms of the whites, in terms of the Night King or Night's King? So we can look at those negative reigns, to say the least, those reigns that caused a lot of pain, and start to imbue them with a duality in the same way that we can look at the reigns that were peaceful and prosperous. We can look at somebody like Viserys and the way that he's trying to please. We can look at Viserys all the way from the Great Council and the pressure that was then placed upon him. We can retroactively look back at what the old King Jaehaerys told him as heir, this Song of Ice and Fire. And suddenly, when he's trying to please Otto Hightower, when he's trying to please his brother Daemon, when he's trying to please Corlys, Breezebury, the other lords, we've suddenly realized, oh, this is a man trying to keep things together, because the point here is that every Targaryen king or queen now thinks that they are going to be the one to face this. There is no timetable on the Song of Ice and Fire. There is no timetable on Aegon's dream. So that makes things really complicated, because everybody not only has to face the pressure of ruling, they have to face the pressure of potentially leading. And those are very different things. And that's a thing that Martin gets into a lot. It's a thing that Game of Thrones got into a lot. And Jaehaerys, coming off of this peaceful reign, maybe he took that other approach. And maybe he imbued that peace, imbued that mentality, imbued that ability to work with people into Viserys, because he saw that as the better way, that to rise up against this force, to take on something that could end the world of men, that could destroy mankind, not just the continent of Westeros, but eventually the world. Maybe he saw that we need to be on a united front. And so we've seen all these different reactions. And depending on when this information stops, which we don't know, we can move that mentality and layer things in thematically. This paranoia that is so key to later Targaryens like Daenerys and Viserys, and even Rhaegar. Rhaegar, much has been made famously of his obsession with prophecy, of the way that he thought that his children would fulfill something greater. Is that why he named his child Aegon? Is that why he named his other child Jon Snow, Aegon? Which brings me into this final point about Game of Thrones. A lot has been made of what Viserys said in his actual phrasing, that it needs to be a Targaryen on the Iron Throne. And that is understandable. However, it's the unreliable nature of prophecies. Just ask Melisandre and Stannis Baratheon about prophecies, and they'll tell you it's not always exactly the vibe that we gathered. Sometimes it could be a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That's one of the magical things about prophecies, not literal magic, although sometimes in stories, sometimes they're misread. To borrow a quote from another big fantasy franchise that we love, Star Wars, Yoda says a prophecy that may have been misread. It's a very, very interesting thing to think about what that actually means. Did it mean an Iron Throne? Because Aegon had not made the Iron Throne until he conquered. So what was the actual literal dream vision that he saw? What was the imagery? What were the words that he heard? If he heard a voice in his head, however it was going to be portrayed, there was no Iron Throne. So it stands to reason. Maybe that's sort of what he then told his heir once he had it. You got to sit here. But that doesn't mean literal. For me, that means a position of leadership. For me, that means the person that can step up and actually bring peoples together. And when you look at the two people that were able to do that, you have Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, the Khaleesi of the Great Gas Sea, the Mother of Dragons, the Breaker of Chains, titles, and Jon Snow. He's King of the North. And the way that they are able to come together is on paralleling paths where they have both taken small folk, taken the downtrodden, taken the outcasts, and elevated them up to higher heights. They've been able to take people like the wildlings, people like the unsullied, people like the Dothraki, people like even individuals, the way that Jon acts with the other outcasts at the wall. Like, that's their mentality. That's what they do. They get people to believe in them, and they were able to unite a force that stood in the long night. Now, of course, Game of Thrones season 8, safe to say, a little controversial. I'm not sure if you've heard, but at the same time, we can look at that and we can see their similarities and their differences. And perhaps it was one of them fulfilling Aegon's A Song of Ice and Fire dream. Perhaps it was the other one. Perhaps it was both in different ways. And perhaps they're meant to represent this duality. Perhaps they are supposed to be a little bit of Maegor, a little bit of Jaehaerys, a little bit of Viserys, a little bit of the Mad King. Maybe it's supposed to represent these different reactions to the responsibility of leadership, and how we're able to see these things blend together in the stories of Dany and Jon is fascinating to me. It changes everything. It imbues the Targaryens with a completely different tone, a completely different energy. The fact that a conquest happened, yes, because they could, yes, because they had dragon fire, as Viserys says in the pilot for House of the Dragon. It's a power that man maybe shouldn't have trifled with, but at the same time, we have to consider if there was something of an altruistic, heroic, of course, these might be generous words, but an altruistic and heroic motivation for actually taking over the land. Maybe there was a good reason. Now, we can analyze that dream and that ambition and that goal and say that maybe this information should have been shared, that maybe it's the hubris of House Targaryen that made them perhaps not so fit to carry this burden. Maybe they should have told the Baratheons and Starks, especially the Starks, or some Karstarks and maybe some Tullys, like, get some people that are allied together already and figure this out as a whole instead of shouldering this burden. But the hubris and the nobility and the power are all elements of House Targaryen. There are other small things that I love if you're putting this in the context of the great long night that is coming, of this force of ice in the Song of Ice and Fire. The fact that Targaryens, since their days in Old Valyria, have burned their dead. The fact that they have that custom, is that something that makes them fit? Is that why some deity or spirit or God or something touched Aegon with this dream? Is that why he was the one? Because his family was already suited for this, because they saw greatness, and because some other greater force wanted to nudge that family into making the right choices and wielding the power of the dragons in a positive way? These are the kinds of questions that I love thinking about, that I love breaking down, and I love analyzing within the context of A Song of Ice and Fire. And I am so glad that Kondal Sapochnik and, of course, George R. R. Martin imbued this now mystery, this exciting piece of lore and mythology into House of the Dragon, so that when we rewatch the entire run years from now, all the shows, we're going to be able to look at it from a different way. So, how did you interpret Aegon's dream? I want to know. Comment below, DM us, hit us up on Twitter at Casterly Talk. I'm Alden Diaz. You can hit me up personally at that Alden Diaz, ThatAldenDiaz. Hit up, of course, the Grand Maester, the Archmaester, the Lord Commander of Casterly Talk, Ken Knapsack, on Twitter and Instagram. And catch us for all of our episode discussions that happen every week on House of the Dragon. We're also going to be covering Rings of Power when that starts here. We're going to have a little bit of a fantasy stew here going on Casterly Talk. But for right now, thanks so much for watching. We love hearing from you, and we wish you good fortune in the wars to come.